A man that needs no introduction, obviously.
Already sitting down.
He's already sitting down. Maybe I should be sitting down. I'm not really sure of the... Sir, Professor, or Professor Sir.
I'm not Sir yet, no.
Is it not? Is it?
Call me Sir if you like.
Well, he's got so many accolades that I would be here forever describing them, and he really doesn't need any introduction because you've probably all seen him on the television or heard him on the radio. He's a very celebrated, popular, bit of a self-selected group in a way, and scientists have an expertise that is valued and acknowledged by this group. But of course, this isn't representative of the general public, and we're moving into a society where there is ever more opportunity for people to broadcast to huge populations all kinds of theories and conspiracies, misinformation. And we are in danger, I think, of moving into a time where scientists are just holders of another opinion in this general kind of noise that's happening. So Jim has been working in this field for a long time and has some fears about this. Jim, personally, from my experience in the last 10 years, it's been a bit of a mixed bag. So, for example, some of the areas where science, some of the crises that we face where trust in science is so crucial, things like the climate crisis and the global pandemic that we're still living through, really have brought this to the fore. But in my experience, the climate crisis we've actually seen a reduction in climate denial and climate denialism, whereas the pandemic, we've seen this rise in anti-vaxxers, in anti-maskers and so on. What is your experience?
Well, I mean, to be honest, I think we've always had suspicion of science and scientists. We've always had anti-science in society. I think what we're seeing now is because of the internet, and in particular social media amplifying it, we hear every view. I mean, life was simpler in the past when you read one newspaper, you watched one sort of TV channel, you maybe surround yourself with friends, colleagues, family who thought the way you do. So we had confirmation bias. We've always had that. That's just part of the human condition. But we weren't exposed to all these other views. And so I think what we see now, when we see a rise, I mean, I think there are more flat earthers now than there were 20 years ago, despite the fact that we're pretty confident the Earth isn't flat.
But do you have any evidence? Isn't it just as equally valid to say, for balance, that the Earth is also flat as well as spherical?
I think that's what we see on social media. My opinion is as valid as your evidence, your expertise. It is a worry. So it's amplified a problem that has always been around. I mean, when it comes to the pandemic, on the one hand, I think, I've often said that it's, one of the few silver linings is that science and the way science works has been in the spotlight for 2 years. Not that people now know what our factors are and exponential curves and so on.
When people started coming up to me, parents at the school gate, talking about R values,
exactly.
I knew that there had been some sort of seismic change in society.
But simply understanding how science works, I think that's been a positive, that's been a good thing. Yes, there are those people who don't appreciate that science is about uncertainty. It's about gathering data and evidence.
This is something that's actually really key, isn't it? Because there is uncertainty, and that is something that runs through science, and that scientists have a different concept of to the popular understanding of the meaning of uncertainty. So, for example, we have the theory of evolution. And we have models that produce uncertainty.
It's just a theory, or if you're uncertain,
yes, exactly.
Uncertainty doesn't mean we don't know.
But does it give a sort of window of opportunity to deniers and to the ministries of doubt and the merchants of doubt?
Yeah, of course, because they don't appreciate that. What we try and get across is uncertainty doesn't mean we don't know. It means we know what we don't know. That's a very important distinction. We put error bars. When we say we're 95, 99% confident about something, that doesn't mean, there's a 1% chance that you're wrong. Therefore, there were those people who said, hang on a minute, at the start of the pandemic, you told us wash your hands and sing happy birthday twice through. Certainly that was the rule in the UK, and you won't catch COVID. Now you tell us we've got to open windows and wear masks. Why did you change your mind? You know nothing. And so getting across that is how science works. We do change our minds. We admit our mistakes. We move on in the light of new data. So getting across how science works, I think, is something that has happened. But you're right. It does seem to be, on the one hand, the wider public have an appreciation of how science works more than they did ever before. That is a good thing. But at the same time, the democratization of information through the internet and social media has meant that everyone feels they have a voice, everyone has an opinion, and
we've lost the gatekeepers, and in some ways that's great because anybody can publish.
Yes.
Who are the gatekeepers? How do we decide who decides what we have access to? And there is that trope, what the mainstream media won't tell you about COVID and what the mainstream media is hiding from you about whatever. Yeah. There is that trope.
Yeah.
But those gatekeepers actually have expertise. And so what they're doing is essentially filtering out a lot of evidence, a lot of material which is not evidence-based, and ensuring a quality of content. On the other hand, it isn't as democratic. I mean, where are we going with this? Do you think we should completely remove any? I mean, with the internet, we have done that, but then there are trusted sites, the BBC or whatever, which has an ethical duty to try and
and there will always but there will always be those groups who will say the mainstream media telling you that, and the Big Brother or whoever, these scientists,
and it's very seductive, isn't it? Because it's more emotive content, and you're privy to some sort of secret information.
But that's always been the case. That's always been around. If we think 25 years ago, when the scientific community didn't stand up in the face of the MMR debacle or GM food or even things like nuclear power. I mean, controversial but very important issues based on science and engineering and technology. Those who knew, the experts, didn't feel they wanted to enter the fray, but we weren't aware that the other side, the conspiracy theorists were winning, because it would appear in certain tabloid newspapers, and that was it. But once the internet allowed for all those voices to have a say and shout, we see it, as though somehow it's a new thing, that it's just appeared, that suddenly this anti-science sentiment. It has grown. I think you're right. Democratization of information is a great thing, but our next step now is, how do we apply the filter? How do we know? Because we're not all experts in these issues. How do we know what to trust? I've seen something on YouTube, or I read an article online, or someone's told me something. How do you know where that's from? We can't all explore and do our own research to work out whether that comes from a trusted source, or whether it's from someone with a vested interest, or some ideological view that they want to push. And I think we're going to have to make use of technology to help us with this. We have AIs now that do that filter out our spam emails, for example.
Not very well.
Not very well. but I mean, I don't get the sort of the Nigerian princes offering me $10 million.
I'm sorry, I've had so many offers only this week.
Oh, damn it.
I can share with you.
I think I'm a bit short of cash at the moment. I was hoping,
but I mean, this is actually slightly more complex, and there are ethical questions about what we filter out and what we don't.
The biggest example, of course, the Russian state filtering out every other view other than the state-sanctioned view, which is that they're not invading Ukraine at all. They're just reclaiming their own land back. And the Russian people aren't less intelligent than anyone else, but a certain large fraction of Russian society believes what they're being fed because the filter has been applied to only give them one narrative. But even in the West,
there is a there is a cultural system, a cultural norm of believing that one narrative, of being brought up in a society
because
where
of historically that's yes.
Whereas I think in many Western societies people are more questioning, and for a start they are privy to multiple different opinions and viewpoints and perspectives, which may actually be just as legitimate. I mean, even if you believe the data and the evidence-based science and the scientists telling you that COVID is an airborne disease, you catch it in crowded places, and so on. The next step is the question of policy, of what you do about that. And that is something which scientists and evidence cannot necessarily tell you. It is an opinion, but when those things get muddied about, should you stay at home? Should you have a lockdown? Should you have all your vaccinations? Should children be vaccinated who don't necessarily suffer particularly badly with COVID? All these decisions, even if you do agree with the science, I find I quite often have very, very different opinions from people who have a big science background, and who make the policies.
Yes, I mean, I think
so. It can be politicized as well, and that's
inevitably. I mean, and again, we've always had this. It's not a new thing that scientists, we tend to think that, look, here's the scientific evidence. This is the way things are. Why are you not enacting a policy that takes this into account? A politician will turn around and say, look, you're not the elected representatives. We are accountable to society, and we have other things to take into account. It's not just the scientific evidence, it's economics, it's public acceptability. There may be different scientific views. Someone says you have to do this, lockdown because, we want to, and then someone else says, well, if you lock down, there's going to be detrimental longer term effects to the economy, which will have a bigger effect. So the policymakers.
So it's complex. It's complex.
But the policymakers need to understand the complexity and be smart enough to be able to take everything into account, because human affairs are complicated. It's not like me doing an equation in physics. This is the equation. If I solve it, this is my solution. This is what happens to the atom when I'm trying to study it.
And yet you have a role, because you are, I mean, not just a scientist, but you have a public platform as well. And so, to what degree have you felt that you have to step in and you have to play that role? Because, I mean, as we were saying a bit earlier, that this is not a new thing. We have had GM, we have had nuclear, we have had all sorts of the MMR vaccine, BSE crisis. We've had a lot of controversial topics, and learning from that, scientists do need to step up. They do need to play a role. But what role is that? Because there is a whole body of society that say that science is very separate from politics and must be kept separate, and science is not political. I mean, I believe science actually is very political, because it's right at the very heart of our society, of what it means to live in this complex society. But how have you and your colleagues grappled with this really tricky issue? I
mean, there's from the trivial extreme where someone like me, has a large following on social media, and I will make a statement that's political or express a political. I tend not to express political views, because I think the people who follow me don't follow me for that. But and then people even with sort of higher profile, people like Brian Cox, who has 3 million plus followers on Twitter.
It's not a competition.
I know it's not a competition. I've got over that now. But it's a little bit bitter. But when Brian Cox makes a political view, you will get people saying, stick to the science, stick to physics, Brian. Hang on a minute. We live in a democracy. Everyone is allowed to have an opinion. He has a big platform, and therefore he has a responsibility in some sense, but that doesn't mean he shouldn't have an opinion. And if it's an opinion based on our expertise, then we have a responsibility to get it across. We're not making the policies. We're not saying this is what's going to happen. We can make recommendations to government. I think during the pandemic, we did see that. on the lectern.
There was a big change.
There was a big change. Yes, you heard our Prime Minister bumbling his way through these press conferences, but on either side of him, he had people who knew what they were talking about, who understood the details, and they tried to a large extent to get across the scientific facts. They're not making the policy decisions, of course.
No, but that again, so in this country, we actually have, scientists are trusted, and science is generally trusted compared to a lot of places.
Absolutely.
That we've been, and if you just go east in Europe, if you go to the United States, there is a much larger contingent that don't believe in science or don't hold science in regard.
And for different reasons.
But one of the problems with that is it's very easily manipulated by politicians. So we heard a lot of, we're following the science, we're following the science. And there is a risk then that scientists become pawns in government policy, which is quite often the antithesis of actually what they're recommending. And that undermines trust in science because, whether it's politicians by their behaviour undermining the science or whether they are almost twisting what the policy is when they issue a recommendation or they issue a report, an expert report, and then actually don't follow the report at all, but say they're following the science.
Yeah, and then when scientists say we never said that, that opinion isn't heard. That's forgotten.
That's forgotten and not heard. Yeah, exactly. I mean, how dangerous is that?
This term, we are following the science, that we heard in this country, it is dangerous because it somehow, as you say, it gives an excuse to politicians to make policy decisions which are not scientifically based. And we've seen with the pandemic, in this country, we've had scientific panels, the SAGE committees, that provide the evidence, and they provide evidence through to the government scientific advisors, who then advise the politicians and the government on policy. But we've also had people step down from those committees because they felt their voice wasn't heard or that it was being manipulated. And there was, there's even an independent SAGE committee that was set up, said because this, we need to get across a view that we don't feel is being listened to, which is based on science and expertise. So there is a worry, but
there is a worry.
It's better than not having any conduit or voice to be listened to.
So scientists are held in high regard, and the way that we make decisions as humans and as a society is a large degree by following leaders, by following somebody with a large Twitter account, or following these influential people, influencers. But for every David Attenborough, there is a Joe Rogan coming out with absolute misinformation, which is followed. And these are quite emotive. They don't acknowledge the complexity. And I think one danger actually is that in order to counter that and in order to strengthen the scientific argument, quite a lot of scientists have felt compelled to also reduce the complexity to one message, which is super worrying.
Thing. Absolutely,
it makes me very worried. I don't know if other people have picked up on this, but it's
we've certainly seen this in through social media and we know that in the West, in the US, in the UK, and other countries, it's debates on issues that are complicated. You just want to shout. It's more complicated than that. It's not black and white, but very important issues that we should be debating and thinking about have been pushed into these extremes. And we know the issues, whether it's the transgender debate or anti-Semitism or Brexit or whatever, you're on one side or the other, black or white. And there's no
even
room.
Worse than that, your entire identity then becomes tied up
with
this binary viewpoint.
So you feel you can't stray at all on other issues,
because otherwise your tribe will you will be no longer aligned with your tribe, and it's really bizarre.
And if you step in and you say, actually, you've got a point, but you've also got a point, and the truth is somewhere in the grey. I mean, it's not in the middle. It'll probably, if we had a debate about an issue and examined it carefully and rationally within our society and with our cultural and moral norms, we might find it's closer to one side than the other. But you're not allowed to say that anymore. You're not allowed to say, you've got a point, you've got a point. Because if you're not with me, you're against me. And if you're in the middle anywhere, or anywhere in between, you're attacked then by both sides. And so those people who tend to know more about an issue and how complex it is, know that they're going to be attacked by both sides. And yet they know that it's not binary. So what do? They retreat.
They retreat, and we don't hear their voices.
And what you hear is the two shouty extremes.
Yeah, and another danger, because of how science works, and because you can analyze very small parts of one very big complex thing, people can find data somewhere that will support their argument. They will find a peer-reviewed paper, which if you don't look too closely is exactly in support of whatever crazy argument or whatever very simplified argument they have.
Yeah.
And so I wonder, while we have all these channels and while we have these very extreme positions, people are very much persuaded by their group, by the tribe that they have found commonality with, and they found a home with, and so to leave that is uncomfortable and risks being alienated from this group, which they found an identity with.
They're kicked out of the club.
It's become very emotional. And really the idea of thinking for yourself and looking at the evidence is very far away. So I wonder, we now have things like fact check, reality check, these kind of, the BBC has one, but there are plenty of these organisations which actually have, they verify an argument and produce. How useful is that? How useful? I mean, we were talking earlier about this idea that which became an almost a belief, rather. It wasn't based on any evidence, this idea that some random chloroquine or whatever random drug could solve and cure, what the mainstream media won't tell you. Like they're hiding, what doctors are hiding from you, the one small trick to make you lose weight or cure COVID. Yeah. And then so there was the recovery trial set up, which is actually the best model of doing science. But how helpful is that? If the evidence is presented to these people, if the evidence of fact check and reality check is presented, will that change minds? Will it?
I mean, we have to
penetrate that.
I think what we can't do is give up and say that's not going to work. It's not going to change minds. The MMR issue was an example where there was no attempt to try and counter this view that one lone David was fighting against the Goliath of Big Pharma, or they telling you this, but this lone hero is trying to get the truth out that the triple vaccine causes autism in children. It has since been realized that he was unethical. One of
the problem was he was given a platform.
He was given, exactly,
by reputable. Exactly. By the Lancet.
So first of all, there's a responsibility by those like the scientific journals or the responsible
Can you just explain, in case people don't know, how the recovery trial system works, and how unbiased it is against various random cures?
Yes. Well, first of all, I mean, if people understand how science works, then the way we test the efficacy of a drug or vaccine is to undergo clinical trials, and the larger the sample that you check, the more reliable the truth will be, the evidence will be. The recovery trial was set up even before lockdown in early March 2020, because they knew it was coming. They knew the pandemic. And so we need to check if people catch COVID. We need to know what drugs do or don't work to help people who already, not the vaccine, which is to prevent you getting it in the first place, but the drug that helps with recovery. And what was fantastic about it was that they didn't have to look for volunteers to carry out a clinical trial. There were the unfortunate volunteers in hospital beds under critical care. And so all these acute hospital wards all around the country became part of the trial. And very quickly, they realized what drugs might work and what drugs don't work. The public, I don't think, know enough about it. In fact, I'm recording a program today on the Life Scientific for Radio 4 with the person who set up the recovery trial, Martin Landray. So I'm doing my bit getting that across, to how it worked. Hydrochloroquine, which Donald Trump swore by, it was shown by this trial to be absolutely useless. Other drugs that we thought might help, things like aspirin, also doesn't work. I mean, for this, blood thinners and blood clotters don't work. So we learn what works and what doesn't work through doing science, through doing statistical big trial.
And some things dropped out that were unexpected. I think there was a steroid that surprised people by being fairly effective.
And you can't remember the name, and I can't remember the name either, which is really bad. But I'm sure people in the audience might know. But yes, so they did discover drugs that could save a large fraction of people who might otherwise have died from COVID. So they've saved, I think, 1 million lives worldwide through this drug trial, finding out what does and doesn't work.
So it's not just a proof of drugs working, but it's a proof of the whole system of science.
The proof of the scientific method as a reliable way of learning.
Scientific method as accelerating solutions. So it's not just the sort of evolution of trying everything and who doesn't die.
Yeah,
continues to try that method.
It's not about getting across.
Faster.
We are scientists, we're experts, we know what we're talking about because we've studied this for a long time. That won't persuade some fraction of society. What does persuade them is to show how the scientific method works and how a scientific idea compares with a conspiracy theory. I always say, when people say, how do you tackle a conspiracy theorist, if they think the Earth is flat or that we never went to the moon.
How do you tackle? Because that is an enduring issue.
Yeah, the one thing you can ask a conspiracy theorist is, what evidence, what data could I present to you that would persuade you to change your mind, that you're wrong? And they would have to admit that nothing would. Absolutely.
But
nothing.
if you were to say that to a scientist, if you were to say that to Martin
Landray,
Landray, if you were to say to Martin Landray, what evidence can I put to you to show that the recovery program doesn't work? He would be able to say, presumably, well, if it didn't produce drugs that worked, but they were shown in another trial to work.
Yes.
So he's open to his idea being disproved.
Which is exactly how I always say in science, it's okay to admit mistakes because that's how we learn.
Although scientists have egos.
Look, individual scientists have egos. Not all scientists are ethical and have integrity. Scientists want to promote and propagate their theory, their idea, their data, their results, because they're human, they have their own reputation. But the scientific method in general, the consensus view, doesn't last for long. If we didn't change our minds in the light of new evidence, we'd still be thinking what the ancient Greeks thought. In science, admitting a mistake, if it's done well, admitting a mistake and moving on, changing your mind, is a strength, not a weakness. The opposite of politics. In politics, admitting your mistake is a weakness. Very, very different. And I think it would be refreshing if they could take a leaf out of the way science works.
I mean, God. Now, it is cultural. There is a huge cultural input in trust in science, trust in scientists and the scientific method, and belief in conspiracies, belief in unprovable, religious, spiritual, whatever. And we see that. So trust in science is pretty high in this country. And we can see that partly in things like the attitudes towards genetic modification, which was handled actually much better by the government than MMR and other things. The attitudes to vaccination, a very high proportion of our adults and children are vaccinated. Whereas if you go to a country where questioning things is not part of the culture and is actually massively discouraged, for example, China has had to to a certain extent, I mean, it's a policy decision, have these very long lockdowns because their elderly population isn't vaccinated. They haven't been vaccinated because there isn't trust. Because they've been told to vaccinate, but the trust isn't there in science. And we're seeing that also in large aspects of the US, especially when it's been led by people that have undermined scientists and science all the way through, as the Trump administration did.
Yeah.
And that's something that is difficult, especially when a large number of people get their viewpoints, their beliefs, their trust, what they trust about the world, their news about the world from social media channels like Facebook. Now, you were talking earlier about the prospect of AI somehow helping with this, and we've seen, I know certainly on Twitter, I don't really go on Facebook very often, but on Twitter, there are little notifications now when certain trigger issues are mentioned, whether it's COVID vaccination or climate. I've noticed it for climate now, sending you to a more reliable source.
Yes.
Is that going to work for Facebook? What can we do? Because this is actually, it's undermining democracy, it's undermining trust in institutions, in science, and it's really bad. It's dangerous and deadly for people's health.
Absolutely. I mean, I think the problem is much more acute and difficult to tackle in countries where they don't have, if they're not living in democracy, or they don't have an advanced education system, for example, where it teaches the scientific method, or countries where religion holds very strongly in the minds of wider society, which makes them suspicious of science simply because it's somehow an atheist construct.
An atheist construct, and also a different opinion to an equally valid religious opinion. When I was in Bucharest very recently, just very briefly, talking about human evolution, and it's a talk that I've done so many times, and I was asked at least 4 times whether it's actually true that humans originally evolved in Africa, because the Adam and Eve story is so prominent. And this is Europe. It was quite surprising.
But I'm saying this is not a new problem, right?
No.
In fact, we are developing every generation in all around the world, particularly because now of the internet, are exposed to how science works and how we learn and how we gain knowledge about the world. So I think things are getting better. Things aren't going backwards. The problem, of course, is in countries where we should know better, where we do have what we hope is a good education system, where children learn about evolution, about the importance of scientific method and testing hypotheses and changing your mind. There's no excuse. And America, is a big example. America, for many years, obviously, has been very polarized like this. So, coming back to your point about the Facebook and Twitter and Google and YouTube, I mean, if they have a responsibility.
They have a responsibility, but if they're not using humans to gatekeep and they're using an algorithm, do we not have this we've seen how algorithms are racist, are sexist, because, obviously it's
because they're created by racist and sexist people.
Who are so unaware that they don't realise these problems. Are we not falling into another trap where we become almost authoritarian in what is allowed through?
If it's a person who's deciding, who's making a decision on whether a website is to be trusted, whether it's a reliable source or not, then you do have to question what is the ideological worldview of that person making that decision, and taking that away and giving it to AI should be a step in the right direction. You're right. AI algorithms are written by people who have unconscious bias and who will build in things that so we have to do better. I think, and I think AI is coming. There's no point hiding away from the fact that AI is going to change the world.
I mean, we live in a world.
Absolutely, but it's going to change our world even more, probably certainly as much as the internet has over the past 3 decades. So we need to build in AI that is, there's something people talk about having a trust index. where certain
Right.
things, the AI will
Because
automatically
AI is
blind
there,
me.
but AI is not there at the moment. It doesn't have a role at the moment in deciding these very complex.
No,
human-
nor should we at this moment, until we build sort of AI minds in, I don't know if you've ever read Ian M. Banks' Culture series, right? So
I haven't read that one.
in the very, very distant future, you have these AIs, the minds with a capital M, that are far more intelligent than humans.
Yeah.
So they can make very sensible moral decisions about things. We're nowhere near that. We don't ask AI to make moral decisions. Philosophers are still arguing about whether there is any such thing as an absolute moral truth. What I think is morally correct may not be thought that in 100 years ago or 100 years from now or in another culture.
Although what I think is morally correct is
Clearly, what you think is absolutely right. But I mean, AIs are going to have to help us to filter, not based on this AI thinks this is right or this is wrong, but simply based on digging in, where did this evidence come from? Is it coming from is it a consensus view, say, if it's a scientific view? Is it coming from peer review? Not if it's just coming from one source. That can be
So what Twitter is doing at the moment with just sort of highlighting there are certain keywords used in a tweet, and that triggers the AI to post this thing, sending you to a site to check. I don't know if people then go to the site to check and suddenly all is revealed. This is not true, this tweet. I don't know how successful that process is. But if we're talking about something a little bit more sophisticated, where some of these very extreme views, like take chloroquine to cure yourself from COVID, something like that, are actually filtered out and we don't see them. They don't appear on our Facebook feed or something. I think there is a genuine, a valid concern about this, that people are saying, hang on a minute, who is making the decision about what to hide, what information to hide from me? But can the AI even be, do we even have the capability for it to understand the nuance of something being presented and realize that somebody is arguing against it or making a reasoned discussion about it versus promoting a dangerous?
I think AI is, in that sense, it's not making a decision about this person's politics are extreme and therefore I'm going to remove it. That's what we need,
isn't it? That's what we need, an AI that is capable of understanding when misinformation is being presented as opposed to a reasoned argument using the same keywords.
Yes, we need it to filter out the fake news, the misinformation, the disinformation, but not necessarily, certainly at the moment, based on because the person promoting that view has an ideological view that Twitter or Facebook or whatever don't like, but it's based on whether that view is based on evidence that it can explore. An AI can explore the internet billions of times faster than a human can go and do their own research. And what it looks for is this opinion backed up by evidence that is regarded by how we define reliable evidence as a society.
And it's comprehensive. We have the ability now to create AI with comprehensive skills that are capable of working out what argument exactly is being presented and whether that, do we?
Well, certainly it can point to, this view is based on evidence that is not accepted as the norm by the consensus of experts in that field. It doesn't say it's right or wrong, or that you shouldn't be listening to this view, but it should be able to figure out whether something is accepted. There's this idea of a trust index. It puts something up higher on the trust index if it is something, if it's based on evidence that is accepted as reliable by the people who know what they're talking about. And we should, as a society, decide on who are those people who know what they're talking about.
Yeah.
The Joe Rogan versus the David Attenboroughs,
And what about having legal backing for this? I mean, Joe Rogan is legally allowed to present his views.
Yeah.
But because of his enormous influence, that can be very damaging. If there's some bloke in the pub ranting his mad theories,
only his three mates listen to him.
And probably they're not even listening. So it's fine. It's complete harmless. But if somebody is doing that with a microphone, if the President of the United States is doing that, it's extremely damaging.
Well, we can't...
So how do we, are our institutions ready for this massive onslaught of misinformation? Are our communication systems, our media channels ready to handle this? When the radio was first invented, it was, hello. Recording from the BBC. It was one voice saying one thing to the nations that was very, very modulated. Now we have a mad person in the pub talking to lots of vulnerable listeners.
Two things. One is that we don't have to have this insist on this idea of false balance. That if 99% of climate scientists say we are damaging the Earth's climate, and you get that rogue 1%. These are probably numbers that are saying no. You don't give them equal platform.
And yet we do. We still do for a lot of political. Take, for example, Brexit, which is very damaging. I think the vast majority of scientists would agree to scientific collaboration, science in this country, to the whole business of our scientific institutions.
That's not
and
even
progress.
in any doubt.
It's not in any doubt, and yet we don't get that. We get an absolute false equivalent balance if we listen to.
Yeah, I think so. So the idea of false balance is wrong, but the other issue is you can't silence.
No, because that makes it more desirable, and the more
also,
of a secret.
We have free speech. I mean, the flip side is what in the culture wars that people refer to as cancel culture, that you silence someone because you feel their view is so anti your worldview that they should not have a right to be heard, and I think that is a danger. Because then who are the gatekeepers? Who decides what voices can and can't be heard? But what you can do is say all voices get heard, but we have a trust index. We have a way of saying this is a more reliable viewpoint because this is a viewpoint backed up by the vast majority of people who know the issue, the complexity of that issue.
And how close are we doing that as a society at the moment, this trust? How, when you see, read, hear reports of various things coming out in social media channels and in mainstream media channels, how often do you think that perspective of what we should trust and what we shouldn't trust is really being conveyed?
Oh, we're a long way. We're a long way from that now.
I also think we're a long way,
I think we're talking about it now. As part of the dialogue, and certainly the big... we're going back to questions,
Okay. Well, before we do that, I'm just going to ask you, at the moment we are... This is quite new still. 15 years ago... I don't think there was Facebook, Twitter, all of the... We're in this new explosion of craziness.
Yeah.
It's very hard to gain perspective of where we are because we're actually in the middle of this big transition. Is this some sort of horrendous nadir of misinformation, and we're all going to become a lot wiser, more mature, and understand how to navigate it a lot better and this is just a kind of blip of, when the printing press was invented and mad pamphlets came out about everything, and we're going to go down a new path? Or do you think this is the way it's going and just going to get worse and worse?
No, I've always been a glass half full person. I agree. I think it is exactly that we've got this new tool that has democratized information. It has meant that we're now deluged with information on a daily basis from every direction. But I think we are now having to learn how to make use of this tool in an enlightened way. And I think, the big companies, the Googles and the Twitters and the Facebooks, are now taking tentative steps towards it, but that we have such a long way to go. I don't think this is a horrible pit of despair and society is all going to rack and ruin. It's just going to get worse and worse and worse. I think exactly that. It's a new technology. It's a new way of dealing with information that we're going to have to, as a society, learn to cope with. So I would like to think that in 20 years from now, we will have the filters, we will have the ability to discriminate, we will know what to trust and what not to trust.
Well, Jim, I have monopolised you too long, and some of these lovely people will have questions. And gentleman in the second row. Just here, sorry, first row, second, yeah.
Hello, thank you so much. I was hoping to actually ask a trusted person.
That's me, obviously.
Yeah, obviously. On some of the issues in science. So, you know, I've read up on like issues with studies not being able to be replicated and issues with p-hacking, and I was kind of wondering how worried you are. Is it something to be worried about? What's being done? Why not?
So, he's asking a question. I don't know if people can all hear this, but he's asking about the replication crisis.
Yeah.
Jim, what's that?
It is a worry. But it's a worry in certain areas of science. You know, this idea of p-hacking and just taking the data that you like, that fits your narrative, that fits your theory, publishing results in journals which end up being completely wrong. I think there is absolutely... Would I call it a crisis? Well, maybe in certain areas of science it is a crisis. You see, I come from the natural sciences, from physics, where that isn't such a problem, where the science that we do is pretty much value free. You know, the way that star either exploded as supernova or it didn't. 10 billion years ago. So there's stuff about the world that through science we can learn, and it's reliable, and we don't have such an issue. But certainly in other areas, particularly in the social sciences, it really is a problem. The whole peer review process, I think, needs to be looked at and examined. So I agree, it depends. Science is very, very broad. In some areas there's more of an issue than in others.
Anyone who attributes brain scan and behaviour as well.
Yes, okay, yeah.
I've just realised I've totally screwed up with the time. I thought it was the half-past time. Should we take one more question, or do you want to?
We're done for questions now.
I'm so sorry. It's entirely my fault. I was looking at the countdown clock, and I
hope we said some interesting things that maybe answered questions that people might have had anyway.
I think so. But thank you so much to both of you. This was such a fantastic talk.